Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Genome BC's President and CEO, Suzanne Gill.
Thank you for joining us tonight at the annual Don Ricks Distinguished Keynote Address. I know we are all excited to be here and to listen to the distinguished Dr. Wade Davis. My name is Suzanne Gill, and I'm President and CEO at Genome BC. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is located on the shared, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This land acknowledgement is one way that we can acknowledge Indigenous presence and the land rights and recognize colonial history and the need for change in society, as this legacy continues to impact Indigenous people and communities. We are delighted to have all of you very curious minds in the room tonight, and I would like to especially welcome our students from Mosscrop Secondary, Heritage Woods Secondary, the British Columbia Girl Guides, and members of Science World's Future Science Leaders program. I'm excited to see you all here and thrilled to see your excitement for science and genomics, and your journey into science is an opportunity to shape the future. Follow your curiosity. You are the source of tomorrow's discoveries and the architects of future innovations that will change the world. I spoke to a few students this afternoon from Mosscrop, and also someone named Ellie Palmer, a future marine biologist. This is the 14th annual Don Ricks Distinguished Keynote Address. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and remember the person this event is named after. Don Ricks was a scientist, innovator, philanthropist, and founder of Genome British Columbia, who dedicated his life to the Canadian life sciences community. He had a keen interest in biotechnology and believed that technology and innovation were the foundation upon which to build the future of British Columbia. He knew that new innovations lead to new industries, and they also lead to breakthroughs in science and new treatments in medicine. As a physician, Don saw the need for better diagnostics, and he helped build a system of clinical labs, life labs. And this event is a way to recognize his legacy. And before we get to our keynote, I would like to share a little bit about Genome British Columbia and our origin story. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the completion of the Human Genome Project, an incredible endeavor, a moonshot really, that took 13 years and $3 billion. Today, we can do the same thing in a day for a few $100. And over 20 years ago, Canada and BC had the opportunity to create a path for society to benefit for this new emerging field of discovery of genomics, to pave the way for personalized medicine based on each unique genetic makeup that we all are. And Genome BC was created to do just that, to make significant investments in world-class genomics research and technologies, which created the foundation for the thriving life sciences industry we have in BC today. And to date, Genome BC has invested in over 500 world-class research projects and supported the development of 170 companies. And we work at the nexus of research and business with partners in academia, Indigenous communities, government, and industry. From developing new tools and treatments for COVID, improving the surveillance of avian flu, to protecting our blueberry crops from pests. And we also bring traditional Indigenous knowledge together with scientific evidence. For example, to better understand which fish species supported Indigenous communities over time in our local waters. Now, a few practical things about today's program. Following the presentation, there'll be a 30-minute Q&A with Dr. Wade Davis and our Chief Scientific Officer. And you may use one of the microphones. I think there's one in each aisles. And today's conversation isn't happening just in this room. It's also on social media. So yes, students, you can be on your phone. Just turn the ringer off. So after today's talk, we invite you all to join us for a reception outside the doors in the back there. And we want to meet you. All the Genome BC genomies, I guess, are wearing the green lanyards, and you can ask them pretty much anything. There's also a pop-up Gene School booth and a trivia challenge. And we also want you to have a chance to meet Dr. Kaylee Byers, who is host of our award-winning international podcast. And she'll be at the back, just directly behind these doors. And finally, this event is for you. So when you get that survey in your inbox, please provide us with your feedback and help us deliver the best experience for you next year. And now I would like to invite our Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Federica de Palma.
Thank you, Suzanne. So good afternoon, everyone. Previous Don Rick's Distinguished Keynote series have focused on the genomics impact on health, agriculture, conservation, as well as forensic science. But today we have something rather different, a distinctively enriching experience for you. We have the honor to welcome Dr. Wade Davis, an esteemed anthropologist and author whose work transcends the conventional boundaries of academic disciplines. Dr. Davis' credentials are as diverse as they are impressive. He is not only a cultural anthropologist and a professor at the UBC Department of Anthropology, but also an acclaimed photographer, a best-selling author, an honorary citizen of Colombia. And this is the part I actually share with Wade. When we met, we engaged in a very thrilling conversation about Colombia a month ago and about our mutual experiences in there. Me focusing on genomics, I found out, while he focusing on anthropologies. His contributions have been recognized with membership in the Order of Canada and the title of Explorer in Residence at the National Geographic Society, where he was celebrated as one of the explorers of the millennium. His academic achievements include degrees in anthropology and biology, as well as a PhD in ethnobotany from Harvard University. Dr. Davis' prolific contributions to literature and film span 375 articles, 23 books, and 40 film credits, matched only by the diversity of his experience as a plant explorer, as a logger, as a park ranger, and much more. Yet, above all, Dr. Davis is a fervent advocate for the preservation of cultural and biological diversity. His career is marked by the harmonious integration of scientific rigor with a profound reverence for humanity's diverse cultures. In an age grappling with environmental and cultural upheavals, Dr. Davis stands as a vanguard, a scholar, and a steward, crafting bridges between science, tradition, and advocacy. While at first glance, the connection between anthropology and genomics may seem tenuous, Dr. Davis' exploration of human diversity through anthropological lenses resonates deeply with principles of genomics. His address today will delve into how indigenous wisdom, deeply rooted in environmental stewardship, can synergize with genomic insights to tackle pressing global challenges of today, such as biodiversity conservation, climate change, and the safeguarding of cultural diversity. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with immense pleasure that I introduce Dr. Wade Davis, who will deliver the Genome BC 2023 Don Rick's Distinguished Keynote Address.
Wow, that was a wonderful introduction, Frederica. Thank you so much, and thanks to Sally Greenwood, who really orchestrated all of this, and of course to Suzanne Gill for that wonderful introduction of the evening. And you see all those things she listed, those students. It's amazing what you can do if you've never had a job. You know, that's the thing you have to, we'll talk about that later. First of all, it's wonderful to be with you. I've been on a rabid tour. In the last 11 weeks, I've been in 11 countries, delivered 8 keynotes and 11 other lectures, and finished a book and sailed from the Solomon Islands through Vanuatu to Norfolk Island and New Zealand. So I thought I was going to slow down at 70, but apparently, but you know, we're coming on Christmas, a joyous day that will, however, be remembered by many biologists with a tinge of sadness, because my good friend Tom Lovejoy, who coined the term biodiversity in 1980, passed away 2 Christmases ago on Christmas Day. And in one of those strange kind of serendipitous moments in history, I suppose, E.O. Wilson, the legendary biologist whose impact on biology in his lifetime, and indeed in the century, can only be compared to that of Charles Darwin, Professor Wilson passed away on the following day. And the blow to science really brought to mind the deaths of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who, as you know, famously both died on the same day, on the 4th of July in 1826. Lovejoy and Wilson had that kind of stature. They were friends and mentors to an entire generation of field biologists and plant explorers, all inspired by the example they set, not just as scientists, but as activists and communicators, advocates who worked all their lives to celebrate and protect the miracle of biological life and every manifestation of its glory. Now, biodiversity, as both Wilson and Lovejoy conceived it to be, was simply the measure of the abundance and fecundity of nature, which could be quantified by scientific identification and the naming of species. And to date, taxonomists have named an extraordinary 400,000 distinct plants, roughly 36,000 fish, 11,000 birds, and along with over 1 million named insects, and this incredible effort of ours to catalog creation. And that list of insects includes 14,000 species of ants, including 418, which were described by Professor Wilson himself. But though a brilliant taxonomist and the world's authority on ants, Wilson understood the limits of classification. He always looked beneath the surface of things, and just as a tip of an iceberg reveals but part of the story, the physical appearance, the morphology of any life form conceals a universe of inner potential. A single bacterium, Professor Wilson noted, possesses 10 billion bits of genetic data. An insect possesses between 1 and 10 billion bits, depending on the species. If you took the genetic information in just one single ant and translated into a code of English letters printed in a standard format, the string of letters would traverse over 1,000 miles. If the DNA in your body were to be aligned in a single row, it would reach not just to the moon, but to 3,000 celestial spheres, equal distance from the Earth. Now, Professor Wilson, in particular, as both a teacher and a writer, had this amazing way of bringing biology alive, encouraging all of us as scientists to communicate its mysteries. And above all, he taught me what words can do. He was a master of the wondrous. But in the early days, Professor Wilson did have one blind spot, but it was not in any means unique to him. I remember in I think it was the fall of 1979, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had just completed his first tour to North America. And he wound up that tour at Harvard, where he was scheduled to speak in Sanders Theater. Now, that very night, Professor Wilson was scheduled kitty corner in Lowell Lecture Hall to introduce a man called Norman Myers, who had just written a book called The Sinking Ark, which was kind of one of the very first books to speak of the looming biodiversity crisis. And naturally, all the students were across the way with the faculty lined up to hear His Holiness. And in apologizing to the sparse audience in the Lowell Lecture Hall, Professor Wilson said, and I quote, "If even Harvard students can't get their priorities right, and they'd rather be across the way listening to," and this is what he said, "that religious kook, then you know how far we've got to go to educate the public at large." Now, Ed, who was a deep friend of mine, a wonderful mentor, a man I admired, would be the first to regret those remarks, but they're in fact typical of an era in which the social scientists did not speak to the natural scientists. The naturalists tended to look upon people, particularly indigenous people, as part of the problem, and the social scientists couldn't bear the elitism of the naturalist. And it really was a kind of chasm. And that night I was the only student on that campus running back and forth between the two talks, because I understood, of course, what we all know now, that the forces impacting the wonder of biological diversity are the very same forces eroding the wonder of cultural diversity. Now, mercifully, this divide has been bridged in a way that would have both pleased Professor Wilson and is perhaps the greatest blessing of our age. Now, he famously noted that we're living through what he called the sixth great extinction, the Anthropocene. And it's the first extinction, clearly, to be caused by our species. But there's a very important distinction to be made. Extinction, along with climate change, threatens all of humanity, but neither was caused by humanity as a whole. Instead, both came about as a consequence of a particular worldview relatively new to the human experience and absolutely not shared by the majority of cultures of the world. And understanding this dynamic is absolutely essential because it's the key to opening new realms of possibilities that will generate the promise, in the words of Father Thomas Berry, of a new dream of the earth. Now, one of the joys of travel, as you've all experienced, is the opportunity to live amongst those who have not forgotten the old ways, who still feel it pass in the wind, touch it in stones polished by rain, taste it in the bitter leaves of plants. And just to know that in this moment, jaguar shamans still journey beyond the Milky Way, or that in the high Arctic, the myths of the Inuit elders still resonate with meaning, or that in the Himalaya, the Buddhists still pursue the breath of the Dharma, is to remember the central revelation of anthropology. And that is the idea that the world into which you were born, your cultural realm, does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one set of adaptive choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. But whether it is a voodoo acolyte in Haiti, a yak herder on the slopes of Chomolungma in Tibet, an eagle hunter in Kazakhstan, or a thunderhoof shaman in Mongolia, all of these peoples teach us that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other ways of orienting yourself in social, spiritual, and ecological space. Now, together, as I argued in an early book and called Light at the Edge of the World, the cultures of the world make up a kind of social web of life that envelops the planet and is as important to the well-being of the planet as is the biological web of life that you know as a biosphere. And in that book, I coined the term ethnosphere to kind of just try to create an organizing principle. And I defined the ethnosphere as the sum total of all ideas and intuitions, thoughts and dreams, myths and memories brought into being by the human imagination since the dawn of consciousness. The ethnosphere is the essence of what we've created and the promise of what we can create as a wildly creative and innovative species. But just as the biosphere is being severely impacted with the loss of habitat and the concomitant loss of plant and animal life, so too is the ethnosphere, but at a far greater rate. No biologist would dare say, for example, that 50% of all plants and animals are moribund, because it's simply not the case. But that the most apocalyptic scenario in the realm of biological diversity scarcely approaches what we know to be the most optimistic scenario in the realm of cultural diversity. And the great indicator of that, of course, is language loss. When each of us were born, there were 7,000 languages spoken in the world. Now, a language, as you well know, is not simply a body of vocabulary or a set of grammatical rules. A language is a flash of the human spirit. It's a vehicle through which the soul of a culture comes into the material world. Every language I wrote in that book is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. And of those 7,000 languages spoken the day that you were born, by absolute academic consensus amongst linguists, fully half aren't being whispered into the ears of infants, which means they're on the brink of extinction, which means that we're literally living through an era where, by definition, half of humanity's intellectual, social, spiritual knowledge is at risk. Now, tragically, this is happening in the very era when genetics has come to the fore to liberate us from the most haunting inclinations of our past. You know, we have finally come, because of genetics, to understand and appreciate the value of every single one of those voices. Because over the last 20 or 30 years, geneticists have actually proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always hoped to be true, and that is the fact that we are brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. Literally, genetics has proven the common roots of humanity, and nothing in our lifetimes has done more to liberate ourselves from the parochial tyrannies that have haunted us since the dawn of awareness. You know, I think 10,000 years from now, there are going to be two things that we've experienced from science that will be remembered. What I'm about to explore with this revelation of genetics, and of course the other has to be the image of the Earth from space that came back to us from Apollo in the late 1960s. And that vision of the Earth from space absolutely transformed our lives. You know, we grew up in a world where just getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. Nobody spoke about the biosphere or biodiversity. Now those terms are part of the vernacular of school children. And the revelations of that moment have swept the world, entered the zeitgeist. You know, in 1970, not one country in the world had a Ministry of the Environment. Now everyone does, however effective they may be. I maintain that the revelations brought to us by genetics haven't begun to enter the zeitgeist. And when they do, it will be a moment of liberation unlike anything experienced in the history of humanity, which is precisely why I am so dismissive of critical race theory, which is both nihilistic, stupid, and hateful. Because to suggest that my children are born inherently racist is in fact to deny the promise of genetics. To suggest that the vision that Martin Luther King had of a world in which people were judged by their character, not the color of their skin, to say that if one believes and hopes that might be true, you are somehow inherently a racist, is the kind of circular logic that we can only find in puritanical cults. But above all, it denies the incredible promise of this moment. Studies of the human genome have revealed with no doubt that the genetic endowment is a single continuum. Race truly is a fiction. You know, I've got this great friend of mine, a Polynesian stand-up comic who does a great routine about sunscreen and vitamin D. White and black all comes down to two things: people in northern climes needing vitamin D and therefore having pale skin, and people in the tropics needing suntan lotion and having dark skins. Black and white comes down to nothing more than sunscreen and vitamin D, and yet that conceit has been the cruelest conceit of humanity. It's been shameful for generations, but now we're on the edge of absolutely destroying that conceit. And what this means is that we are all cut from the same genetic cloth. We are all descendants of common ancestors, including those who stayed home in Africa and those who took to the open road, walking out of Africa some 65,000 years ago and embarking on this extraordinary hijra, this diaspora that over the course of 2,500 generations carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here's the important idea that brings in anthropology. If we are all cut from the same fabric of life, then by definition we share the same mental acuity, the same raw human potential, the same genius. And critically, whether this genius, this intellectual potential, is exercised through technological innovation and wizardry, the great achievement of the West, or through the untangling of complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and orientation, adaptive insights, and cultural emphasis. There is no hierarchy in the realm of culture, no evolutionary ladder to success. That old Victorian idea that we somehow went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of the Strand of London and the streets of Paris has been, you know, the idea that European society was sort of the apex of a pyramid that slipped down the slopes to the so-called primitives of the world, has been absolutely repudiated and rejected by science, shown to be a 19th century concept, is irrelevant to our lives today than the notion held so strongly by clergymen in that century that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. The brilliance of scientific research and the revelations of modern genetics has affirmed in an astonishing way both the unity of humanity and the essential wisdom of cultural relativism, the great gift of those radical iconoclasts who gathered around Franz Boas, destined to change the world. Most of them were women: Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, the incomparable Zora Neale Hurston. You know, and Margaret Mead, how many of you seen that famous quote from Margaret Mead that you never doubt that one person could change the world because it's all that's ever done, Everybody's always thought that that was her either being naive or perhaps glib or no. It was a statement of fact because she had done it. The group that gathered around Franz Boas were those who gifted us the world that we know today. We live in the social realm of their dreams. So all of this means that the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. Every culture, by definition, is a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in the 7,000 voices of humanity, and those answers become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us in the coming generations. Every culture really does have something to say. Each deserves to be heard, just as none has a monopoly on the route to the divine. But the challenge becomes, what do you do about this? If you're a biologist or an oceanographer and you identify an area in the sea or an area in land that has a high concentration of endemism, you try to make a protected area. But you can't make a rainforest park of the mind. You can't sequester people in time like some kind of zoological specimen. Change is the one constant in history. You don't preserve culture, you preserve jam. Culture is always changing. People always are dancing with new possibilities for life. So when I was recruited to the National Geographic in 1998 as part of the Explorer in Residence program that was part of the Society's desire to personify the fact that they created science. They didn't just tell you about science, and that they were serious about turning their mission for their second century into not just informing you about the world, but helping you save the world. My mission as the anthropologist was to change the worldview, the way the world viewed and valued culture in a decade. It was a completely audacious aspiration, and we quickly settled on the fact that politicians follow but never lead, polemics are never persuasive, academics study themselves, but storytellers change the world. And so we set out into the ethnosphere to find stories of the other, not in the way of traditional ethnographic films that so often, almost exploit the exoticism of the other. No, we wanted to go into cultural realities where that reality demonstrated the fact that every culture shares the same genius. So I'll just share one of those examples this evening. We started off in the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination, Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels upon the southern seas. And here was a civilization that had managed to settle the greatest ocean realm on Earth. These were sailors who could name 250 stars in the night sky, who could sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon, simply watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the sacred canoe, Hokulea. These were sailors who in the darkness could sense as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the canoe, distinguishing those caused by local weather disturbances from the deep currents that pulsated across the ocean. And, in the early years of exploration, the European sailors found these extraordinary fleets of these catamarans, and they couldn't understand it because at that time, most European transports hugged the shores of continents for fear of the open ocean, because that was only solved by the British discovering the chronometer in the 18th century, but we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, the ancestors of the Polynesians, probably from Taiwan and the Philippines, sailed east into the rising sun. They reached Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, and then the diaspora stopped for about 1,000 years. The written language was lost, the ceramic tradition was lost, but not a sense of the power of the winds, the meaning of the stars, the ancestors that came out of the east. And about 1,000 years after that settlement, the movement began again, and they reached eventually 4,000 kilometers across the Pacific to the Marquesas, southeast to Rapa Nui or Easter Island, northwest to Hawaii, and roughly around the time of the First Crusade, reaching the shores of Aotearoa, what we call New Zealand. Now, the most amazing thing about this tradition is that it was based on dead reckoning. And dead reckoning meant that you only knew where you are by remembering precisely how you got there. And there was the impossibility of using dead reckoning on an open oceanic voyage that kept most European transports hugging the shores of continents. But the Wayfinders had solved that problem, but it implied something rather extraordinary. The navigator, sitting monk-like on the stern of the vessel for 3 and 4 weeks, barely sleeping, had to remember every sign of the wind, every sign of the stars, the moon, the birds, the animals, the salinity in the sea. And if that record of memory, together with the order of its acquisition, was somehow lost, if he or she fell asleep, the journey could end in disaster. So you begin to think about what that meant for a society that lacked the written word. So indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. Now, as one travels through these truly astonishing cultural spheres, inevitably you end up holding up a mirror to oneself. And one of the things that I came to understand, of course, is that like any culture, we too are a product of our history. And during the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, as the European tradition struggled to liberate ourselves from the tyranny of absolute faith, we abandoned myth, magic, mysticism, but critically metaphor. And when René Descartes declared that the universe was simply mind and mechanism, with a single phrase, he deanimated all sentient beings and the earth itself. Science, as Saul Bellow said, would make a house cleaning of belief. Phenomena that could not be observed and measured could not exist. The triumph of secular materialism became the very conceit of modernity. The notion that land could have anima, that the flight of a hawk might have meaning, that the spirits could have true resonance, was ridiculed, reduced to the ridiculous. Now, this intellectual innovation of the Enlightenment, of course, gave us great gifts, the scientific method, the brilliance of allopathic medicine, among many marvels. But on the other hand, the reduction of the world to a mechanism with nature is but an obstacle to overcome, a resource to be used, has also in good measure determined the way that our historical tradition has interacted with a living planet. You know, I was raised to believe that the forests of coastal British Columbia existed to be cut. That was the basis of the ideology of scientific forestry that I learned at university and practiced in the woods as a logger. Now, that perspective was profoundly different than a youth from the Kwakwaka'wakw from Alert Bay raised to believe that those same forests were the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven, spirits that would have to be embraced, cannibal spirits, during the Hamatsa initiation so that order would be restored to the world. Now, the point is not to say who is right and who is wrong. Is a forest mere cellulose and raw material, or is it the domain of the spirits? Is a mountain a sacred place? Does a river follow the path of an anaconda? Who is to say? But it doesn't matter. Ultimately, what does matter is the potency of a belief and the manner in which a conviction plays out in the day-to-day lives of a people. For in a very real sense, that determines the ecological footprint of a culture, the impact that any society will have on the environment. A child raised to believe that a mountain is the abode of a protective deity will be a profoundly different human being than one brought up to believe that a mountain is simply an inert mass of rock ready to be mined. The full measure of a culture, any culture, embraces both the actions of a people and the quality of their aspirations, the nature of the metaphors that propel them onward. And I think here lies the essence of the relationship between many indigenous peoples and the natural world. These people are not Rousseauian, and they certainly aren't readers of Thoreau. There's not a lot of room for sentimentality in the cold winds of the Arctic, the open expanses of the Tibetan plateau. But on the other hand, mountains and forests are not perceived as being inanimate, as mere props on a stage where only the human drama unfolds. For these societies, the land is very much alive, a dynamic force to be embraced by the human imagination and transformed by that human imagination. The ethnographic record makes it clear that reciprocity, not extraction, is the norm. Some iteration of the basic idea that just as the earth owes its bounty to humans, humans owe their fidelity to the earth. Now, critically, the ethnographic record confirms that this is not hippie ethnography, wishful rhetoric. It's the actual way in which the vast majority of human cultures have lived for all of their histories. Now, this intuition plays out in ritual, and ritual is just the means by which humans make manifest the sacred. In a small community where I've lived since 1980, and I have adopted so many godchildren, Chinchero, outside of Cusco, there's an annual ritual called the Movimiento, in which, and by the way, in the Andes, this idea of reciprocity involves everything. Not just social relations with the land itself. In a dynamic landscape of earthquakes where a frost can destroy the agricultural labor of a year in a few minutes, there is this very strong sense of reciprocity between human beings and landscape, which is celebrated in these rituals. Once each year, the fastest young boy in every hamlet is given the honor of becoming a woman. And he puts on the clothing of his sister and he becomes what's known as a Wailaka. And he then has to lead all able-bodied men on a race. But it's not your ordinary race. It starts off at 11,500 feet, runs down to 9,000 feet, and then they run to 16,000 feet, crossing two more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a long ritual day that is less a run than an ordeal. And of course, what's going on is the Wailaka spins to bring the forces of the feminine to the mountaintop. The perimeter of the run is marked by holy mounds of earth, itos, where he must spin and give coca to Pachamama, libations of alcohol to the wind. And the whole idea is that you go into the ritual day as an individual, but through exhaustion and sacrifice means in Latin to make sacred, you emerge as a single pulse that has reaffirmed your sense of belonging to the community, to the land, but also your obligations to protect that land. Now as Gail, my wife who is here, we were down there when I was foolish enough to participate in the Movimiento at the age of 48, the oldest man ever to run it, the only outsider ever to complete it. And I only got through the day by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 8,000 year history of the plant. Actually, what happened, I really got through it because for 10 years or more at that time, actually 20 years, I had been adopting godchildren and putting them through school and buying cows for the family. And when all of my ahijalos found out that their padrino was stupid enough to run the Movimiento at age 48, they clung to me throughout the entire day, offered me herbs and encouragement. They weren't going to let anything happen to their cash cow. But these localized rituals become pan-Andean in Peru. Events like the Coyariti. For most of the year, the Sinicara Valley is isolated home to a few shepherds and their flocks. But between the Feast of the Ascension and Corpus Christi, as the Pleiades emerge in the sky, tens of thousands of pilgrims converge on the sacred valley. It's a kind of syncretic Catholic pre-Columbian event where a vision of Christ was seen at one point in the valley. So the crosses of the communities are carried up laboriously through the stages of the cross, men, women, and children. And they get into the valley, but the ultimate moment is when the Pablitos, those who are empowered to deal with the deities and the darkness of the spirits of the dead, literally carry the crosses up into the ice fields of the Cocapunca Glacier, all in the shadow of Ausangati, the most sacred mountain of the Inca, the ultimate Apu deity. And there the crosses are left for 48 hours until the dawn of the third day, where down below in the valley, tens of thousands of people, men and women, are kneeling as the light of the sun bathes the valley. And then the Pablitos come down, bringing the crosses, which have once again been re-empowered for another year. So all of this is pilgrimage through sacred geography, homage to the gods, and all of it becomes a collective prayer for the cultural survival of the entire Andean world. Now, we don't have to go as far as Peru to see the wonder of these ideas. I have spent a great deal of time in Tahltan country. We have a fish camp there. I was the first park ranger in Spatsizi. Now, the Tahltan territory in northwest British Columbia is 36,000 square miles. That landmass, the traditional territory of the Tahltan, is larger than 85 countries in the United Nations, including Israel, Austria, Panama, Switzerland, and Kuwait. And I was the first park ranger in Spatsizi under an NDP government, and my job description was wonderfully imprecise: wilderness assessment and public relations. And in 2 4-month seasons, I saw 10 people, so there was no one to relate publicly to, and wilderness assessment was licensed to wander with my horse. And in the course of that, I found an old shaman's grave that led me to this remarkable man, Atahena, a Gitsan elder who had been brought into the groundhog country by his father, who was a great friend of the legendary outlaw Simon Gunanut. Now, we forget in British Columbia that until the building of the Panama Canal, this was about as far from Europe as you could get. So at a time when Montreal was entering the 3rd century and the Amazon had been explored for 400 years, Vancouver hadn't yet made contact with the First Nations of this coast. The northwest quadrant of this province is the size of Oregon. There's one road. And the farthest you can get away from a road in the United States is 20 miles. The Tahltan territory is the kind of place you could throw England and they never find it. And Alex Jack was 43 years old. He died in 1999. When I met him, he was 43 years old before he had sustained contact with white society. His soul had not been crushed in the residential schools. He was a hunter, and his very vocabulary was inspired by the sounds of the wild. And just as we can hear the voice of a character when we read a Victorian novel, Alec could hear the voices of animals. And when he told a story, he always did so in a way that the listener actually witnessed and experienced the essence of the tale, entering the narrative and becoming transfixed by all the syllables of nature. Every telling was a moment of renewal, a chance to engage the very dance of the universe. Many of his stories were stories of Wiket, the trickster transformer of Gitsan lore, the figure of folly who, with his kind of idiocy and pride, taught the people how to live. He used his language very carefully, Alex. He would never say a man's not supposed to hurt an animal because a hunter must kill to live. But he'd always say one must not suffer an animal because that implied humiliation and dominance. Alex would never speak ill of the wind. When he hunted, he spoke to the prey by name with praise and admiration. His grandmother was Cree, possessed of the medicine power, and as a carrier elder told the great anthropologist Diogenes, we know what the animals do, what their needs are. We were taught by the animals themselves. The priests say we lie, but we know better. The white man writes down everything in a book so it'll be not forgotten. But our ancestors married animals, learned their ways, and passed on this knowledge from one generation to another. I once asked Alec, I recorded these stories for almost 40 years, and I once asked him how long the cycle of tales was, and he said, oh, that's a good question. He had asked his own father that, and to find out they had put on snowshoes in March month, the time of good ice, and begun to walk from one end of Bear Lake to the other, and as Alex recalled, all the way there, all the way back. Story not halfway done, but the beautiful metaphor was to measure the duration of a sacred tale. You had to move through sacred geography, telling the tale if the myth was to be honored and inspired. Well, this idea of a connection between landscape, myth, future, past, and present really becomes extraordinary when you enter the deserts of Australia. Now, when the first humans reached the shores of Australia, and we know, by the way, from studies of the Y chromosome, that the ancestors of the Aboriginal people of Australia were the very first humans to walk out of Africa. And when they reached there, they went walking and established 10,000 clan territories, all of which were bound together by the song lines, the tracks that were followed at the dawn of time as the ancestral beings sang the world into existence. The song lines are also the trajectory created by the rainbow serpent as he moved through the continent. And as Aboriginal people today trace the song lines and chant the stories of the first dawning, they enter the dream time, which is neither a dream nor a measure of the passage of time. It's the very realm of the ancestors, a parallel universe where the ordinary laws of time, space, and motion don't apply, where past, future, and present literally merge into one. And so to walk the song lines is to become part of the ongoing creation of the world, a place that both exists and is constantly being formed. So the Aborigines are not just attached to the earth, they are essential to its existence. Without the land, they would die, but without the people, the earth would wither. And should the rituals stop and the voices fall silent, everything would be lost, because everything in the universe is linked together and held together by the song lines, just as everything is subordinate to the dreaming, which is constant, but every changing. Every landmark is wedded to a memory of its origin, and yet in the process of being born. Now, when the British washed ashore in Australia, they encountered a people that looked strange, had a simple material technology, but what really offended the British is the Aboriginal people had no interest whatsoever in progress, and because progress was part of the Victorian notion of life and optimism, notions that died in the mud and blood of Flanders, but very much alive in the settlement period of Australia, the British, in their inimitable way, concluded the Aborigines weren't human at all, and they began to shoot them. As recently as 1902, in the lifetime of my grandfather, it was debated in Parliament in Melbourne as to whether or not Aborigines were human or not. In the 1950s, when I was a boy, ranchers had quotas as to how many Abos could be shot with impunity who trespassed upon the land. As recently as the 1960s, there was a school book used in curricula across Australia, a treasury of fauna of Australia, that included the Aborigines as part of the natural wildlife of the continent. And missing from this was the appreciation of the most subtle of devotional philosophies. Not one of the dialects, the 670 dialects and languages of Australia, is there a word for time, for past, present, and future. In fact, all that exists is reverence for what exists now. The entire purpose of life for this civilization was the antithesis of progress. It was stability. You were supposed to only do the ritual gestures along the song line that went through your clan territory that were deemed to be essential to maintain the world just as it was at the time of its creation. It would be like all Western science having focused on pruning the shrubs in the Garden of Eden to keep it just as it was when Adam and Eve had their fateful conversation. Now, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. If humanity as a whole had followed this intellectual, devotional philosophy, we wouldn't have put a man on the moon, But on the other hand, we wouldn't be talking about climate change and our capacity to transform the biological life supports of the planet. Now, if we slip into the northwest Amazon, the homeland of the people of the anaconda, the Barasana, the Makuna, the Tanimukos, their most profound realization and revelation is that plants and animals are just people in another dimension of reality. Mythology infuses land and life with meaning. Without the forest, humans would perish, but without people, the natural world would have no order or meaning. They believe that they came up the Milk River from the east in the belly of the sacred serpent. Cognitively, they do not distinguish the color blue from the color green because the canopy of the forest is equated to the canopy of the heavens. They have social structures that facilitate peace, not conflict, not the least of which is a marriage rule that says you must marry someone who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken, but you never hear anyone practicing another tongue. They simply wait, watch, and listen. The shaman is less a priest or a physician than a diplomat who must maintain relations with the entire natural world. He's like a nuclear engineer who must periodically go to the heart of the reactor to reprogram the world. And the shaman moves at ease through mystical dimensions unseen by ordinary eyes, but seen by the Barasana and Makuna. And their ritual ceremonies involve men coming together with women to ingest ayahuasca or yahe, this powerful psychoactive substance, which is taken not to heal the individual, but to contribute to the cultural survival of the collective. Because as they take yahe, they become not symbols or metaphors for the ancestors, they become the ancestors. Just as the golden plumes are not symbols of the sun, they are the rays of the sun. And under the influence of ayahuasca, in this 3 and 4 day ceremony, the ancestors journey to all the sacred sites in their territory, realigning themselves with those sites and affirming their obligation to maintain those sites. And so the fascinating thing is that when we really begin to deconstruct these cosmological and mythological ideas, they all come together into what is essentially a very sophisticated and complex land management plan dictating exactly how people in great numbers could live in the Amazon rainforest. Now, if we go to the mountains of the Sierra Nevada, the Kogi, the Wiwa, the Arahuacos, 500 years after the conquest, the sun priests of the Tairona are still here to inform us. Perched in their mountain slopes, they look down on the very beaches that Columbus arrived at on his 3rd voyage. They are still ruled by a ritual priesthood of mamos. The training for the priesthood is extraordinary. They believe that their rituals and prayers literally maintain the cosmic balance of the world. Their sacred plant is hayu. They consume a pound of coca leaves every day. As they move through the mountains, they describe their movements as threads, so that over the lifetime of a person, you weave a sacred cloth over the earth itself. The training for the priesthood involves 18 years of isolation and ritual delineation. And after 18 years, when the acolyte is not allowed to see the sun, does not see a woman, eats a ritual diet, can never leave the environs of the sacred temple, much the pedagogy in its remote religiosity taught at night, suddenly he is taken out on a journey to the heart of the world. He has been told for 18 years that his rituals will maintain the well-being of the earth. And then suddenly, at 18, he sees a skyline. He sees a mountain. He sees a forest. And the priest who has trained them essentially says, you see, it's as I've told you. The earth is that beautiful. It's yours to protect. They call themselves the elder brothers, and they dismiss the rest of us who they say have ruined the world as the younger brothers. They make no distinction between the water found in a river and the blood that flows through a human body. As infants, of course, all of our bodies are essentially liquid, and if you compressed all of our bones and ligaments and muscle and sinew, extracted the platelets and cells from a body, the rest of us, nearly 2/3 of our weight, would in fact flow to the sea just as a river does. And so imbuing water with a sense of the sacred as they do is not in fact contrary to science, but rather an acknowledgement of the complexity and wonder of ecological and biological systems that science alone has illuminated. And these voices are being heard. This is a very close friend of mine and Federico's, Mamo Camilo. And just a quick anecdote, I was with Mamo Camilo when he said to me one day, in Spanish, peace won't matter. This is in Colombia, of course. If it's only an excuse for the three sides to come together to maintain a war against nature, it's time to make peace with the entire natural world. Then as we went to make a ritual payment at the mouth of the Rio Magdalena, he casually said to me that President Juan Manuel Santos was scheduled to visit their community at Namasima in 3 days, and he asked if I'd be able to be there. And the only way, I promised to try, but the only way possible was to hitch a ride on the presidential plane. So this would not be possible in Canada, but magic is daily occurrence in Colombia. I made a phone call to someone who made a phone call, who made a phone call to somebody else. Before I knew it, I had an invitation from the Palacio Nariño. We'd love to have Profi Davis come along. So as we were on the plane flying up to the north coast to get the helicopters to enter the mountains, the president's aides were peppering him with statistics. And I sheepishly put up my hand and said, Presidente, para los mamos, los datos no valen nada. Lo que es importante es lo que es en su corazón. Statistics don't mean anything to the mamos. What matters is what's in your heart. And then I repeated what Camilo had said to me. La paz no vale nada si es solamente una manera en que los varios lados del conflicto pueden unificarse para mantener una guerra contra la naturaleza. And that's what the president made the theme of his speech that went out to the world that day from Namasima. That's kind of a wondrous example of how the voices of these people are finally being heard. Now we have this idea, nevertheless, that these societies are quaint and colorful, but somehow destined to fade away as if by natural law, as if they're failed attempts at being modern, failed attempts at keeping up. Nothing could be further from the truth. Change is no threat to culture. Technology is no threat to culture. What is a threat to culture is power. And in every case, these are dynamic, living peoples being driven out of existence by identifiable forces. And my first book on zombies was made into a terrible Hollywood movie. And Hemingway said, if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, go back to Tucson, throw your book over, go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. I disappeared in the forests of the Panan, the last nomadic peoples of Southeast Asia. And nomadic societies are very unusual. How do you measure wealth in a culture where everything has to be carried on your back and there's no incentive whatsoever to acquire material objects? Wealth is defined explicitly as the strength of social relations between people. Because if those relations fray, everybody suffers. I once gave sharing is an automatic reflex. There's no word for thank you. I once gave a cigarette to an old woman in an encampment and watched in my amazement as she tore it apart to distribute the individual strands of tobacco equitably to every hut, rendering the product useless, honoring her obligation to share. And by the time I got to Borneo, the sounds of the forest had become the sounds of machinery, and they were suffering from the highest rate of deforestation in the tropical world. And women had been turned into prostitutes, the forests into logging camps, the rivers running so thick with silt that it seemed as if half of Borneo was slipping away to the South China Sea, where the freighters hung heavy on the horizon. Power is a threat to culture, which is actually an optimistic observation, because if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we can surely be the facilitators of cultural survival. This is Martine von Hildebrand on your left. In 1985, President Virgilio Barco of Colombia said to Martine, an anthropologist, do something for the Indians. And in 5 years of head of Indian affairs, Martine did more than something. He secured legal land title to an area of land in the northwest Amazon of Colombia larger than the United Kingdom, homeland of 57 ethnicities, and then behind a wall of isolation caused by the agonies of modern Colombia, a new dream of culture was born. it's encoded in the 1991 Constitution of Colombia that these lands will be forever the homeland of the first people. And once that land was secured, culture could indeed be reborn. And this is really an important lesson. You know, Asik Nialik, one of my closest friends who just died among the Panan, once asked me by a campfire if it was true that my people had gone to the moon, and if so, why had they bothered to go if they just brought back dust and rocks, 828 pounds altogether. And you know, he was onto something. You know, we spend billions of dollars sending probes into space to try to find water on Mars or on the moons of Jupiter, while spending equal amounts of money on industrial schemes here at home that compromise the rivers and lakes, so the sources of our fresh water. Just think about it. If one of these space probes were to find evidence of 10 species of life on the surface of Mars, the news would rock the world. Imagine discovering a blue planet teeming with millions and millions of species, but that's what we already have, right here where we live, an Eden that can never be replicated elsewhere in the universe. You know, on one of our many trips together, Tom Lovejoy said to me, anyone who thinks that economy trumps ecology should try counting their money with a plastic bag tied tight around their neck. You know, Martine and the Badasana did a really interesting exchange with 3 Guattari princes, if you can imagine, where 3 princes from Doha went to the Northwest Amazon and 3 shaman went to Doha. Well, the princes hated every moment of it. And I was in Doha when the shaman arrived. They were kind of dressed like a bad Mexican mariachi band. And we went out eagle hunting with our hosts that afternoon. And as I watched their faces, they got sadder and sadder and sadder in that Guattari desert. And when they finally went back to Bogota and went to see Martine, Martine asked, you know, ¿Cómo fue? How was it? Oh, Martine, terrible. Más terrible que terrible. And what was wrong? What was the problem? Those people over there are so poor, all they've got is money. And that was what they took away from a place that had no rivers, no lakes, no forests, and was, from their point of view, simply the worst. Now, all of this is not to suggest some kind of return to a non-industrial past, or that any culture be asked to forfeit its right to benefit from the best of modernity, the genius of technology. It's rather, it's not about the traditional versus the modern. It's about finding ways that everybody can engage with the modern, but critically without that engagement demanding the death of their ethnicity. And the reason that's so important is that culture is not trivial. Culture is not decorative. It's not the songs we sing, the prayers we utter, the costumes we wear. Culture is fundamentally about a body of moral and ethical values that we wrap around each individual human being to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies within all humans. It's culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order and meaning in the universe, to do what Lincoln said, always reach for the better angels of our nature. And when people lose their culture, chaos invariably ensues. Every conflict in the world is about fundamentally the erosion or the exploitation of culture. And the reason the voices of these cultures are so important is that their very existence shows that other ways of being are possible. This doesn't mean we're going to echo or mimic anything around us, but it does put the lie to those of us in our own culture who say that we cannot change when we all know we must change the fundamental way in which we inhabit the planet. And I want to just bring it all home to British Columbia, finally. You may have seen news reports yet recently of the incredible discoveries in Mount Adzaidza, where as a glacial summit is melting, all kinds of artifacts, 7, maybe 10,000 years old, that have been frozen in the ice, have been unveiled. Now this again is Tahltan country. This is my good friend Oscar Dennis Hotsata. And Oscar and I spent a lot of time on Adzaidza. It was a sacred mountain of the Tahltan. You could not hunt there if you didn't go through initiations 6 months in duration. It's also the mother lode of obsidian. Obsidian from Adzaidza was traded east as far as the east of the Rockies to Haida, south as far as California. And this heavily mineralized landscape is where the obsidian fields can be found to this day. And Oz and I went in at one point and lifted up quite a bit of obsidian. He had started to chip obsidian, and as we came out the next night, he came over to our place and he gave me a perfectly chipped obsidian blade. And I said, man, how did you learn how to do that? And he said, must have been in my blood. Well, the obsidian is the black blood of the mountain. Well, one night, many years ago, Sata was visiting our fish camp, and also visiting that day was Gujau, head of the Haida Nation at the time. And it was midnight, and they were in this huge argument around the campfire as to the origin of Raven. Because, of course, the Tahltan think that Raven came out of a cliff face at the confluence of the Tahltan and the Stikine, and you all know from Bill Reed's great monumental sculpture that the Haida believe that Raven came out of a clamshell. And, of course, this got very heated, and Oscar was sort of saying, you fucking Haida, some kind of arrogant sons of a... You think Raven would come out of a fucking clamshell? And then, and they'd go back and forth. And I had just by chance flown in from Spatsizi over this extraordinary valley. And I said to the fellows, I don't want to get involved with Raven. But, there's something I just noticed. These rivers are all born in close proximity to each other. The Nass River, homeland of the Nishka, one of the great salmon rivers of the West Coast. And then just over the hill, a pond that if a leaf falls in it at one end of the pond and the wind blows it that way, it goes down the mighty Stikine, home of the Tahltan and the Tlingit at the mouth. If it goes the other way, it goes down the Skeena, which is homeland, of course, the Gitsan, Wet'suwet'en, and Haisel, and ultimately the Haida. This is an extraordinary point of geography. And as we thought it over about 2 in the morning, the word sacred came up. And we suddenly started thinking sacred headwaters. Now, the interesting thing, at the time, Shell had a plan to extract and frack coal bed methane over more than 1 million acres of this valley. There were plans for an anthracite mine, any number of industrial developments. Now, had the industrial side said the obvious, sacred headwaters, that's not a native concept, that's some white guy, probably Wade Davis, we never would have won. But what happened is that idea of the sacred went home that night to Iskut, and the women took it over. And then they began to blockade the one dirt road into the headwaters, and again, sacrifice makes sacred. As they stood in the rain, as hunters in wheelchairs stood in the rain, as this handful of women who had never done anything against the law in their lives, the wife of the chief, the 3 sisters of the chief in particular, stood up and were arrested by the RCMP. They actually transformed the concept. They sanctified the concept. They took hold of the concept, and that became known as the sacred headwaters. And for 10 years, we struggled to protect this area. And in the end, we did so successfully because of the power of language and the power of the idea. And the thing that was most successful in that campaign is what it did to those women. The health and well-being of Iskut was transformed. Suddenly, here were women standing up, having their voices heard, having themselves empowered, standing up and winning against the biggest corporation in the world, Royal Dutch Shell. And this is just what happened in the transformation of Haida Gwaii. It was when people stood up for their rights, stood up for the land, that the well-being and health of the culture itself is transformed. So there's a direct correlation between one's land, one's sense of the spirit, and the power of the sacred when people come together as a community. And that really is a great lesson. The sacred headwaters will never be developed. Anyway, I know I've gone on too long. I'm Irish, I always do. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you for this wonderful discussion. This was really great. Okay, so we have a little bit of time for questions. So you could, there's microphones, I can't see anything, but there's microphones somewhere, and you can just use those, or you can use Slido, or you could use our social media as well. Okay, well, I'll start because Shall I start?
Yeah, sure.
So we have this friend in common, Mamo.
Yeah.
Camillo.
Mamo Camillo.
So I heard you described when you were talking to him. So I happened to be talking to him to try and really understand from their perspective what it meant to them. So, genomics, and we are trying to aid conservation by banking and decoding the genomes of species that are at risk and that are disappearing. We're doing so by extracting the samples, really, extracting the DNA of the samples, really, from the lands that are owned by these indigenous cultures, of course. And we're trying to understand what does sharing the benefits of that means once that decoding, that genome, that sequence information is banked and could be then used for commercial purpose in the future if something, medicine or something really important comes out of that, or anything else. And one of the things that I thought was astonishing was that the answer we got was, and I just wanted to hear your perspective with regard to some of the other perhaps cultural research that you have done. But one of the things we heard was, well, you know everything, he said, you know everything about our world. We don't know anything about your world. So what we want is you to teach us what we don't know so that we can use that and preserve our culture through our ancestors and how they've taught us, essentially. And we can keep teaching our children and et cetera, et cetera. And I was just wondering.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the case of the Kogi and the Arawaku is very, very kind of unique in a way. They have this incredible intensity of religiosity, and some people have even suggested that they're all descendants of the Tairona, which was a civilization on the northern coast of Colombia at the time of the conquest. And there's even a suggestion, and then it was a ruthless conquest, and the survivors retreated into this isolated volcanic massif, which is the highest coastal mountain range on Earth that literally soars to almost 20,000 feet out of the coastal plain, and they reinvented their world. They were isolated for 200 years, and some people even feel that the intensity of their religious belief is sort of like, boy, we must have screwed up the Great Mother. We screwed up to deserve that. We're not going to do that again, And I mean, their costume, for example, is modeled on Spanish uniforms and stuff. And they are incredibly, they've been compared to the Tibetans of South America. I mean, the religiosity is just unbelievable. And so for them, something like genetic analysis is complex, but they're open to it, and they'll be able to understand it through metaphors of their own society. And they are very clever in the way they manipulate the relationship with the outside world. Everybody eventually gets kicked out. It's like, it's transactional, so their desire to learn of our world is absolutely sincere, and it's not contradictory in any way. So, for example, we National Geographic, they were interested in documenting the world visually. We set up film workshops, and that came back to benefit us, because at one time I was making a film and we almost got kidnapped by the FARC. So we had to escape, and we hadn't filmed this one section, but we just handed the fancy cameras to an Arawaku we had trained. He finishes the film beautifully, right? So there, again, these societies, it's not like about isolation. It's like, how do we encourage the Arawaku students, kids, to be every bit as sophisticated in understanding genetics as any kid would be at UBC, but allowing to do them without demanding that they give up their culture, right? It doesn't have to be that way. What happens all around the world is a development paradigm is used as a kind of excuse to disenfranchise native people whose presence on land is an inconvenience to industry often, right? So in terms of compensation, it's a tricky thing, intellectual property compensation. For example, with coca, there's a lot of movements now to decouple coca from cocaine, create a legal nutraceutical product, a market for a very fine product, the best natural stimulant there is. and that has nothing to do with cocaine. And there's 150,000 farmers and farm families in Colombia alone that grow coca. Now the Mamos will say we never want coca, their sacred hayo, to be commercialized. And that's fine, but they don't own all the intellectual property for a plant that's been used for 8,000 years across the entire length of South America. So these questions of compensation are really complicated.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
There's a question over there.
I don't know. Hello? Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. That was really, really nice. I guess I'm thinking in terms of genomics, I think we should clone a whole bunch of you and stick you into schools all over the province.
It's very sweet of you.
Where I'm going with this is, I'm a long time since I was in high school, but in high school or elementary school, we didn't learn anything about different culture throughout the world, nothing. It wasn't until I went to university and I chose my own path to learn that stuff, but we learned nothing. So what are your thoughts on if there was more education at a younger level about different cultures throughout the world, a field trip, to up north to see different ways people think and relate to the world, different cultures? Because I finished high school, our minds are so narrow.
Yeah, but we always have to be loving and patient and understanding of the past. I mean, for example, in 1974, when I first went to live with the Arahuacos, parents of my friends at the Nacional University in Bogota would literally say, ¿Por qué quiere vivir con la gente sucia? Why do you want to live with the dirty people? Now the last 5 Colombian presidents, their first act of office has been to go to the Sierra to pay homage to the Mamos who have emerged as kind of symbols of continuity and patrimony in a country that's been conflicted by our obscene use of cocaine. So, things change. One of the things I was saying to the students earlier, that a really useful exercise is to imagine the values of your great-grandfather about gender, race, sex, role of women, religion. There is not a single thing that your great-grandfather believed you'd agree with. And most of what he believed you'd find morally reprehensible. Now that doesn't mean that you wouldn't love your great-grandfather, but those values have disappeared in good measure because of anthropology. It was Franz Boas and that incredible cohort who challenged the idea of the superiority or the evolutionary rung of rising that always placed white Europeans on top. Anthropology gave us a world we live in. They didn't live to experience it becoming the zeitgeist of the age. But Ruth Benedict said in 1947, the purpose of anthropology is to make the world safe for human differences. Anthropology is the antidote to hate. And so the exciting thing when people get discouraged about, say, racial progress, is to remember how far we've come. In 1967, interracial marriage was still illegal in the majority of American states, right? Which is one of the reasons that I find it very disturbing, the kind of woke orthodoxy which is being laid down on young people in universities, because it is so nihilistic. It denies the hope, it denies the possibility of change when all I've ever witnessed in my life has been positive change. I mean, in my lifetime, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar. What's not to love but a culture capable of such innovation and transformation? So I wouldn't get too discouraged.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have lots of questions coming in. I'm going to alternate, so if you could just, there's a question that is very popular. I actually love this question. So as someone who seems to have packed 10 lives into one, do you have any advice for someone who's trying to figure out what to do with theirs?
Well, that's what I was talking to the kids. Work, never have a job, but work harder than anyone else. The word job comes from the medieval French gobert, meaning to devour. Work comes from the Anglo-Saxon, meaning to create and inspire. For young people, I always quote Jim Whittaker, a good friend of mine, the first American to summit Everest, who said, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. And I always say, I've gotten by. I never knew what I wanted to do, but I was incapable of compromising, and I was patient enough in my neuroses to give my destiny time to find me. But I've never known what I wanted to do, but I sure know what I wouldn't do. And as a result, I only said yes to everything, and I never, like, even, it's horrible to say it for the academics in the audience, but when I was recruited to UBC at the age of 59 as a professor, I don't know, I said, look, I don't go to meetings. I don't do committee work, so if you want me, I'm not going to do that. And they went along with it. I try not to waste time, and I don't know. I've never let anyone, we have this idea that creativity exists in the abstract, but creativity is never the motivation for action, it's the consequence of action. You can't be a photographer if you don't take pictures. So I've never let any category, people go nuts trying to say, I'll put a label on me, oh, professor of anthropology, oh, PhD in botany, voodoo expert, I wrote a book called Into the Silence. It took 12 years, and it was all about the Great War, Mallory, and the conquest of Everest. And my idea for the book from the very beginning is that if you wanted to understand these remarkable men who went to Everest in 1921, 22, and 24, leading to the famous disappearance of Mallory and Irvine as the mist rolled in on the Northeast Ridge and enveloped their memory in myth, how could you ignore the fact that given their class and age, they had gone through 4 years and 4 months of hell on the Western Front? Now, that idea infused my book, but when I got the book contract, it was the biggest book advance in the history of mountaineering. 3 months later, they found Mallory's body, and there were going to be 10 books out by fall. My editor said, we didn't want a book by you on Mallory, we want a book on Mallory, we want a book by you on Mallory, when I offered to give back the advance. And then when I wrote the first 2 chapters that were full of World War I, he scratched them all, he scratched out every reference to the war. He said, I thought this was a book on Everest. And what did I do with that? I just ignored him. And I ended up writing a book that came out and won the prize for the top book in the English language that year. I don't listen. Well, look, Gail's been married to me almost 40 years. I'll go drink with the students. You can't do that. But you can all get the dirt from Gail. It's like, But I think seriously, one of the things I said to the students, which is really important, is that we suggest to the youth, students in particular, that life's linear. You go from A to B to C, and if you skip D and E, you don't get the rest of the alphabet. Every one of you in this audience knows that that's not how it works. Life is made up, as Joseph Campbell said, of a series of crossroads, serendipitous moments when you have to make a choice. And the critical thing is at that moment to have cultivated an inner compass of some sort, so that you're not listening to peers, you're not listening to your parents, you're not listening to teachers, not listening to the social zeitgeist, and you're making your own decision. And that's the key to a happy life. In other words, bitterness, as we all know, comes in old age to those who look back with regret on a life of decisions imposed upon them. Those who live to be old and content are those who can look back on a life that they were in charge of. The greatest creative challenge for any human being is to be architect of your own life. To me, a vocation is nothing. I never thought I could find a career that I would wrap around me like a coat for the rest of my life. To me, a vocation is just a metaphor. It's just a lens through which to experience life, and only for a time. And that's how it really is. All of us change professions 6 and 7 times in our lives. We have this idea that it's much more limited than that.
Thank you, Ray. This is very good. There is a young lady who's losing her will to it while she waits.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
No. So I want to narrow it down and just go very, very tiny. I know 2 languages, and for a lack of a better word, I exist in 2 languages and 2 cultures. I live here. So 2 words in terms of culture that you used in Australia was time and progress. right? In one culture there was no word for time, and then in the other culture that, if it's not progress, it's frowned upon. I'm not sure you can answer this, but was there a word that you learned from another culture that did not exist in the culture where you exist? I don't know if that makes any sense. So, like the way you learned that they don't have time, right? Is there something you learned that we don't have?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it in terms of linguistics because I'm not a linguist and I don't have a very good ear for language. I mean, I speak Spanish, but I'm not good with languages. But I think more like concepts. Like, for example, I worked in the Northwest Amazon and used psychoactive substances with the shaman and so on, and I had certainly experimented, as most of my generation did, with psychedelics. I mean, I always remember my mother saying, don't take these psychedelics, you'll never come back the same, and poor mom didn't understand that was the whole bloody point. But to me, a real breakthrough in my thinking came in Haiti. When I first witnessed spirit possession and saw voodoo acolytes in a state of trance, literally handling burning embers with impunity. I mean, red hot coals the size of an apple in their mouths without harm. I always felt like that line from the Dylan song, there's something happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? And yet that was the idea that the mind in ritual could so powerfully affect the body that bears it was, to me, a real breakthrough. And it made me, I've always been extremely careful never to indulge fantasy or wishful thinking, the kind of hippie ethnography. I mean, my whole reputation is based on authenticity and real research. So you try to keep one foot absolutely in the realm of science that allows you to be very clear when you're speculative or when you're, reaching out a little bit. But Haiti really reminded me that, that things could happen on a physical, spiritual, religious. It's sort of like, psychosomatic doesn't mean fake, it means mind, body. And we all know that we never get sick the day after we fall in love, but we often get sick the day after someone leaves us, So there is something going on, but to see it so powerfully displayed, the Haitians used to always say to me, you white people go to church and speak about God. Indians eat their magic plants and speak to God. We dance in the temple and become God. And that to me was just mind-blowing. I mean, I spent, I went really pretty deep. I even became, when I did my PhD, the last phase of it, I applied to the National Science Foundation to study the secret societies, which were the most powerful arbiter of social and political life in Haiti. They were the fountain that Duvalier Papadoc went to create the dreaded Tontomacoute. And I wanted to study them and enter them. And I got the grant from NSF, but the anonymous Haitian scholars who reviewed the grant literally wrote on it, Davis must be told if he tries to do this, he'll be killed. That was on the grant return. I didn't believe that for a second, but it shows how deeply enmeshed I got. I mean, I got to the point, I had malaria and hepatitis for 2 months and didn't notice. I was just working at night with the societies, Once I had to light myself on fire just to escape something. I mean, it was really crazy. But it was another realm, And Africa is so beautiful. I'm absolutely in love with African civilization, West African civilization.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to read the question from Slido. After living with nomadic communities and seeing how they live, how does the treatment of injuries and sickness compare to our Western idea of healthcare?
Well, allopathic medicine is surely the greatest achievement of humanity. Cut your arm off in a car accident and ask yourself, do you want to be taken to a shaman? Allopathic medicine, for all its specificity, has saved all of our lives. I mean, modern medicine has look what happened. I mean, the vaccines and until COVID, the fastest development of a vaccine had been 4 years for mumps. Who would have guessed that these new I mean, I worship at the feet of allopathic medicine. But that said, it doesn't mean that these other modalities don't have something to say. I really find that the role of the shaman is really interesting precisely because they're not dissecting the body and approaching it with the rigor of Western science,
Thank you. I think it over there.
I like this one. Do you regret anything on your path to where you are now?
You can answer that.
I mean,
Yeah,
not a single thing. I mean, honestly, I'm about to turn 70, and I don't have a single regret in life. Do I, Gail? I don't think I do. I don't know. She's shaking her head. I mean, it's kind of, to regret is such a useless emotion. It's like using the conditional tense, could have, should have, would have. I mean, it's just pointless, right? No, out of all the books you have written, which is your favorite? Into the Silence or Magdalena?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, sure. I can't see. Yeah. Sorry.
That's fine.
But I think if I'm right, you two first and then over there, right? Yeah.
I believe so. So yeah, I have a question. You just used a word that has been very problematic for me for a long time now, Western. Okay. So in the current ongoing of interactions and debates, Western seems to mean to a lot of people the extractive economy, the Judeo-Christian value set, the trampling of everything around us. That's not what it means to me. You just mentioned a little while ago interracial marriage as a modern, enlightened thing to do. To me, it's very ancient.
What's that?
I come from a people that were telling each other that their gods did interracial marriage, that was the thing to do in order to make progress in the realm. And so I'm wondering if we have a soul that we have lost to find again under all the rubble of the conquering forces of Judeo-Christian thinking, whether there isn't something essential and unique to us Westerners that we lost back there and that we might have a very hard time digging out again. I would like to know what you think about that.
Some use a term like Western. It's like shorthand. It's pretty imprecise. But I tend to be very optimistic, and because I've witnessed such positive change in my lifetime. And one of the things that I think I never try to talk about things I don't know anything about, and I don't worry about things I don't know anything about. But I've got, the best advice I ever got from my father. My mother was a kind of a Christian woman, Baptist, who clung to the hope that if we worked hard enough, good would vanquish evil. Just sort of like, the Christ child would vanquish the fallen archangel, the devil. And my father, who'd been broken in the war, had no such illusions. And he used to say to me, son, there's good and evil in the world. Take your side and get on with it. And what he was really saying is that, good and evil walk hand in hand. And the purpose in life is not to vanquish evil, but to do good. And that's a really liberating thing. If you begin to think of life like a pilgrim would, where the goal is not a destination or an achievement, but a state of mind, then you never get disappointed. It seems to me that bitterness comes to those who have expectations that aren't fulfilled. So if you think you're going to win every environmental struggle, it's inevitable you'll be discouraged when you lose a few. But in my case, I don't care if I lose, because I don't expect to win. And that allows me to keep going. And I feel like I've got the same energy and idealism at 70 that I had at 16, only tempered by life experience. It doesn't really answer your question, but you know, those kinds of big questions I don't have an answer to.
Fair enough.
Okay, please, you could, because you've been waiting for a while. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be among all of you guys since last year, and I wanted to ask perhaps two questions. So I think you said something about the first people coming out of Africa and then going to Australia, and we know this from the Y chromosome. Perhaps that's a little bit too technical. I don't want to bore a lot of the students who are just starting to learn about that stuff in their biology courses. So yeah, if you can tell us a bit more about that, that'd be awesome. And but if not, I also want to ask perhaps about my new favorite word that you kept mentioning tonight, hippie ethnography.
Yeah, well, hippie ethnography is like, you know.
Yeah, where did you coin that from? Yeah.
Well, it's just obvious, you know. It's like it goes right back to Carlos Castaneda. You know, I remember seeing his first book, that was treated as you know, his first book got him his PhD at UCLA, and his second book, A Separate Reality, was a very useful document for young students trying to understand this notion of cultural relativism. It was used at Harvard in the anthropology course, the Introduction to Anthropology. But I read the first book, and just from the botany at the back, I knew it was bullshit. And I knew from the Yaqui that they don't act like that. And you know, those books were hugely successful. And when it became clear after the third one, Journey to Ixtlan, that he was just sort of making this stuff up, it really created a reaction. So that even by the time I came along to write The Serpent and the Rainbow, a first-person account in sort of literary nonfiction as opposed to academic writing, I knew it was an academic death knell, right? Because that's just the way it was. And I didn't mind, because I didn't really want to be an academic anyway. But also in a more pernicious way, it's a real form of exploitation. Like there was a notorious book called Mutant Messengers Down Under, where this woman just made up fantasies about Indigenous people of Australia to the extent that she was banned from ever entering Australia again. And I think that, you know, the truth is always more interesting than anything a human being can make up. I mean, I remember the night that I first discovered photosynthesis when I was studying plant physiology. And I think I'm the only person in the history of Harvard to get thrown out of the science library for disturbing the peace. You know, it dawned on me that, I mean, this was a formula of life, you know, that carbon dioxide and water sparked by photons of light would create the food we eat and the air we breathe. By the time I studied that also, I had gone through anthropology, so all the metabolic pathways in biology read to me like origin myths. So it was weird, I could memorize them effortlessly. And when I really got that one, I went absolutely nuts. I raced around to every table of every student, shaking them like this, you know. And that's why I believe to this day, nobody, man or woman, should be able to run for office if they can't recite the formula of photosynthesis. Wouldn't that be a great criteria? I mean, it's really interesting. You can graduate, you could not graduate from UBC if you couldn't tell a photograph from a painting, you know, or, you know, I mean, but you can easily go through and get your degree from UBC without ever having taken a course in biology, you know, and certainly without knowing the formula of photosynthesis, which is kind of amazing.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay, we only have time for a couple more
Sure.
questions. I was wondering if we could do the two
Sure.
on this side,
Sure.
please. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for the presentation. And I just have a question regarding culture. So basically, as you can see, I'm Asian of some type. I'm a Chinese. So basically, it seems to me that, all right, first of all, I have this Chinese cultural background. And also, like, now I'm living in Canada, which is like the Western and the Eastern cultures. I have sort of both of these two cultures in me. And sometimes I feel, oh, these cultures are sort of like conflicting. Like
Yeah.
they are sort of not really good friend with each other. So I just wonder, in like cases like this, do you think there's a way to somehow reduce the effect of culture on an individual? Because I think like our culture really like shape who we are. Like I think this is good because sort of that's just what everyone in this culture does and everyone says. But sometimes if I don't think this is good, but like everyone else, like in this same culture surrounding me, they think, oh, this is good, then there's this like individual versus like the more bigger like culture sort of thing. So I just
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question, you know, and particularly for a country like Canada, you know, where we have so many first new Canadians and trying to come to terms with that. I mean, I think that having, you know, it can drive you crazy to if you're pulled apart between two different cultural norms and conflicting norms. But that's why I think it's so important that we study culture, so that you're not thinking that you're just weird because you're having those impulses or those concerns, but you suddenly realize, well, it makes perfect sense. If you're coming from an ancient culture of China with, you know, the Confucian notions of filial piety and the incredible connection to family and the rootedness, and even having, you know, experienced either directly or visceral or indirectly the agonies of China over the last 150 years. I mean, it's hard to think of a place that's gone through more agonies, in a sense, you know, going right back to Sun Yat-sen's revolution, the incredible treatment, horrible treatment by the Japanese during the war, the civil war that followed that, Mao's mania, the Cultural Revolution. I mean, you know, Mao Zedong killed more of his own people than Hitler and Stalin put together, and that can't be forgotten. But on the other hand, you're a scion of this unbelievable heritage. And so it seems to me that understanding that heritage, even academically, you know, reading about it, being proud of it, that allows you also to recognize that, you know, as you're moving through this place, this cultural realm, which is itself changing all the time because we're becoming more and more Asian by definition, as more and more people, you know, everything's dynamic and changing. But I think the more you kind of study it and then appreciate it, and then maybe it would seem like in your head, like one moment you're responding from this set of values that are antithetical to this set of values, but it's okay in that moment. And then sometimes you see the values coming together. But you know, I taught at UBC this big undergraduate. The one condition I asked when I went there is that I wanted to teach freshmen, right? So I had this big 400 student freshman class with kids from all around the world. And it was really amazing how, I mean, we had probably 60 or 70 countries in that class sometimes, you know. And it was just really amazing to see how much anthropology helped them understand. And I don't mean anthropology like theory. I mean the whole question of, like, the best book of mine for that is The Wayfinders, you know, where I really, that was the book I wish I had had as an undergraduate student trying to struggle with anthropology. But, you know, I think the answer is to be proud of who you are, proud that you can move through these cultural realms, and aware of those realms so you don't allow the two realms to confuse you, you know what I mean? You see something, oh, that's how it's done here, you know. That would be my sense of it. And above all, having your own heritage, figuring out ways to move into whatever realm you're moving into, which is some kind of fusion of this. We're all children of this massive, I mean, think about this, son. You know, in the 1970s, the vast majority of Canadians, Americans, English, and probably Chinese, had never been in an airplane, right? It's hard for you to believe that, but, you know, all this is new. We're all moving into a new world. And so we're all children of this multicultural, pluralistic, global culture, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And to have the richness of the Chinese, do you still speak Mandarin perfectly?
Yeah, I
Excellent,
still speak.
excellent. Don't lose that ever. And then you pick up the English, and you're the future. I mean, you're the future. So don't ever let it disturb you. Just celebrate it, you know?
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
This is more of a psychology-based question, but because you mentioned biases earlier in your presentation, I was just wondering how you think biases could affect student and teenage perspectives and critical thinking.
Bias. Well, I think, yeah, I mean, we all carry with us preconceptions, you know, and part of the act of becoming an educated person is being able to look at those preconceptions and challenge the ones that aren't useful anymore in your life. And you know, I can remember as a kid, not really thinking things, but sometimes saying things, and I was, you know, in a sincere way that I can't believe I said that to someone, you know. But you grow and you change, you know. So we all carry a certain bias, but I mean, we can struggle to escape the constraints of that bias, you know. I don't know if I have much more to say. I don't go too deep into psychology because I don't know what I'd find there, you know. Anyway, thanks a lot, you guys. I know we went long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, and now I'd like to invite the Genome BC Chair of the Board, Dr. Peggy Johnston. You need to stay here.
Hey, Peggy, thank you very much.
Thank you, Federica.
Oh, wow.
And thank you, Wade, for a terrific presentation. I hold here a talking stick. This way, right? There we go. That was hand-carved by the Coast Salish and Musqueam artist Wesley Wise. And as you know, and as many know, the talking stick is an ancient and very powerful communication tool. The person who holds the stick is the person who may talk, and everyone then listens respectfully. And when that person is finished, the talking stick can be passed to others who wish to speak and share their experiences and views, thus ensuring an equitable and respectful communication process. So it seems like it's a perfect gift for you for today.
That's so nice.
You honor us with your presence today. We appreciate the wisdom that you have shared. And we gift this to you in thanks for your spending the day and the time with us, as well as the numerous contributions you've made to science and anthropology, and your unwavering commitment to amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much. Wow, that is so nice of you.
We're gonna get a picture and then we'll have a few more words to say.
Okay, do you want to pick? You don't want a photo?
Yeah, they're gonna do a photo. Okay. Don't go anywhere. We're not done yet. You want us in the front? Yeah.
That's a beautiful gift. Thank you so much. Oh my God. Yeah. I'll hold it like this. Beautiful gift. Thank you all very much. What a gift. Wow. Beautiful.
You want to say a few words?
Yeah, I just
I
just want to thank everybody, and these are the kind of gifts that you don't come your way very often. And I'm very, very touched, actually. I can't thank you enough. Thank you all very much.
To wrap this up today, there are several people I need to acknowledge and thank. First, Federica De Palma for helping to conceptualize, organize, and this event and shape it, as it turned out very nicely, as well as moderating the Q&A. Also want to thank and acknowledge Sally Greenwood for her conceptualization and really orchestrating and putting the team together to make this happen. And a special thanks to her team at Genome BC, who with their volunteers have worked tirelessly behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, at the desk, and everyone to help this happen. Not only at this event, but also many of the other events that Genome BC sponsors to outreach and educate throughout the year. So I invite you all now to go to the mezzanine where there's some light bites and refreshments to continue the conversations, the Q&As. And also, please note, remember that the Genome BC staff are wearing these beautiful green lanyards. So please feel free to engage them and question and ask how genomics benefits us all today and holds promise for the future as well. Thank you for coming, and good night.
Thank you very much.